Hey everybody! This video goes with your chart, which is blank. Mine is filled in and it says Groups of the West. So by the end of this presentation, your chart's going to look a little bit more like my chart, okay? We have finished the Civil War and Reconstruction, and now we're moving into the settlement of the West and the frontier, okay? And then we're going to be moving into a unit, the continuation of the unit, looking at what was going on in the cities. So this unit has a little bit about what's going on in the West, and then more about what's going on in cities and the other parts of the United States. So this is all about the closing of the frontier, or the settlement and consolidation of our holdings in the West. Just a few graphics to remind you what period what area we're talking about geographically. This is called the Great Plains, and this is the area in green here between the Rocky Mountains here and the Midwest and East Mississippi River here. Okay, this is the area we're talking about. You can see that parts of it have become states, but also a good amount of it enters in to the Union during this time period. These states are going to be entered in. And here's a show. This shows you not only the Great Plains, but also all the Native American groups that are in there, like the Wichita, the Comanche, the Kiowa, the Arapaho, Omaha, Cheyenne, Teton, Crow, Blackfoot, Plains Cree. So lots of Native American tribes involved in the Plains as well. And so we're going to be looking at Native Americans and versus Americans in this unit. A lot about how our differing lifestyles and values clash in this time period. Alright, the first group we're looking at then is Native Americans. I've already shown you. Here's another more comprehensive map of all the different tribes that existed out in the Plains area. The key events that happened with Native Americans this time period include the Chivington Massacre. Let me talk a little bit about why American military and the natives come into conflict with each other during this time period. Basically, our ways of living are incompatible. The natives believe that you hold or control land tribally. They don't think that any individual owns any one bit of land. Also, they are nomadic, which means they follow the buffalo as their sole source of sustenance and the way of life, and so they're constantly moving. Whereas our culture tends to be one that is individualistic. We claim individual plots of land, and we have a great premium on owning land and staying on it, staying put. So as we discover more and more land out west that we want for various reasons, whether it be agriculture or mining or those kinds of things, our desire to claim it and their desire for it to be used for nomadic living just clash against each other. So basically our two ways of living are incompatible. And it becomes a primary goal of the U.S. government to claim more and more land from the natives and settle it. And the institution they're going to rely upon to do that is the U.S. Army. So after the Civil War, this is kind of convenient, we have all these Civil War veterans who are looking for work, and the U.S. government is increasingly relying upon the Army to go west and fight Native Americans, establish reservations, police those reservations, those kinds of things. Okay? Some key events related to that is like Colonel Chivington in Colorado. His whole family had been killed in a Native American attack, so he had a little bit of a personal vendetta against Native Americans in general. Probably not the guy to put in charge of a reservation where they were trying to round up natives and force them to live like whites. At one point he ordered the murder of over 200 natives, some of which were sleeping. And that's a key event known as the Chivington Massacre in Colorado. This is another famous event is, so a key person in that is of course Colonel Chivington. Another key event is Custer's last stand. General Custer was fighting against an important strategist of the Sioux, Native American tribe, and his name was Crazy Horse, and their chief was Sitting Bull. And they decided, Sitting Bull ordered Crazy Horse to fight against Custer, and he was surrounded, and all of him and his men were killed. So Custer's last stand involved Custer's last battle against the natives. So here is General Custer right here. This is General Custer. This is Sitting Bull. This is Crazy Horse. And this is the largest, an attempt back here. This is the model, but this is the actual attempt at creating the largest public statue in the United States. And it's a attempted replica of this etching of Crazy Horse. It's really the sole vision of a single man, and he has died and his children have picked it up, but it's just kind of a testament to be the first major public work that's dedicated solely to Native Americans out in the West. So that's a modern example of how the Custer's Last Stand and Crazy Horse continues to be present in our nation's identity. Okay? Then we have the Battle of Wounded Knee. It's kind of the last chapter or last event between us and the natives. It was in South Dakota, and over 300 natives were killed there as we faced off against the natives for their land because we had discovered resources there that we wanted. So over 300 natives were killed there. So here's a painting of Custer's Last Stand. And this is a photograph from Wounded Knee. You can see a mass grave. This looks like something you would almost see from the Holocaust in World War II. A mass grave has been dug here, and there are Native American bodies piled up, getting ready to go into the grave. So you can see indeed how that massacre affected the natives. So, the group is Native Americans, and the government policies or legislation that affected them included a law passed. First of all, it was a reservation system where, remember, Andrew Jackson had moved the natives west, and the idea was we were going to give them all the land west of the Mississippi River. But now we've decided that we want a lot of that land, and so we're going to try and put them on ever smaller pieces of land called reservations. And this leads us to break a lot of treaties, like the Treaty of Fort Laramie, where we had promised them all of this land. And so our final law that's going to affect the Native Americans is called the Dawes Act. And you can see here that what we try and do is we try and break up the reservations into individual plots of land and settle the Native Americans on that land and force them to live like white people in terms of becoming farmers. It's a terrible failure, mainly because the government officials who were in charge of making the Dawes Act come to fruition stole a lot of the seed and the tools that were needed to help the Native Americans. A lot of people think that the Dawes Act was really just a land grab, a way to break up their tribal lands and sell a lot of them off to white people. And it was never really intended to make them economically viable as farmers. Okay? Here's an example of Native Americans as they appeared when they were living tribally and as natives. And you can see as a result of the Americanization attempts, a lot of native children were taken from their parents and sent to boarding schools and Americanized. Their parents were deemed as unfit parents, and so it tried to separate them from their culture and family as a means of rendering them more American, like these pictures would indicate. You can see these children. These are children who look a little bit more native. They aren't fully Americanized as of yet. So this created kind of a schism in native culture where generations no longer could really relate to each other. Also in these boarding schools there was a lot of abuse of children and a lot of things, abuse of power which took place. A key thing for Native Americans, a key cultural characteristic, is their total reliance on the buffalo for their livelihood and source of material needs. And the buffalo are increasingly going to be slaughtered by whites who have discovered the repeater rifle and trains, and it becomes a great sport to come west on the trains and shoot as many buffalo as you can and get a buffalo head to hang on your wall back home. Unfortunately, the slaughter of the buffalo leads to starvation among the natives and makes a lot of them so increasingly desperate that they go to the reservations to receive aid and food rations. This graphic, I know you can't see it that well, but the whole point of it is just to show you how every little part of the buffalo was used for a need for natives. It's kind of like a Walmart on hooves is what I call it. So, for example, they boiled their hoofs to make glue. They used their dung for campfire and smoke signals. They used their bones to make tools and scrapers, and their teeth for necklaces. So there's just lots of uses that they found for the buffalo, and it was a complete source of everything that they needed. All right, so that's everything you need to know about Native Americans in terms of key events, key people, government policies, and cultural characteristics. Now we're moving on to the Cowboys and the ranchers. And it's kind of fascinating how the Cowboys have such a central place in American kind of symbolism, but they actually were around for a relatively short period of time. Let me explain a little bit about how they came to exist. As I understand it, what happened is during the Civil War, there were already a lot of cattle and longhorn steer down in southern Texas. But while the men went to fight in the Civil War, the women folk couldn't quite keep a handle on the animals and just let them reproduce kind of at will. And when the men got home, they realized they had an unbelievable number of steer and cattle that if they could just get them to the meat packing houses of the North, or the Midwest rather, like around Chicago, they can make lots of money on these cattle. The question was how to get them to market. And that is when the cowboy era is born. Because what they start doing is they start getting young men who are also unemployed, maybe Civil War veterans, those kinds of people. They get them to walk the cattle from southern Texas to the railroads in the middle of the country. And then those railroads are going to take them to the Midwest, to the packing houses. So for a short period of time in American history, no more than 30 years, this whole cowboy culture is born. Okay? So the key events you need to know in being a cowboy is, first of all, you have to corral the cattle before you're going to walk them to the railroads, and you have to brand them with your symbol so you know which cattle are yours. So in case cattle rustlers come and try and steal your cattle, you'll know which ones are yours. And then you're going to walk them to the railroads. That's your destination. This is going to be plagued by problems that are going to bring an end to the cowboy era. In 1883, there's some droughts. In 1887, there's a blizzard. In 1880, barbed wire is going to be invented by Joseph Glidden. And that's going to make it impossible to walk the cattle across the open range anymore. And farmers from that point on are going to dominate the plains due to barbed wire. Before this, they'd had to make their fences out of wood, and there wasn't enough wood out west to make the fences, so the open range had been continued to exist. But after 1880s, barbed wire is going to start really keeping people from walking on other people's land. So that's the end of the open range and the end of the cowboy era. Okay, so the cowboy era pretty much ends in the mid-1880s. The key people in the cowboy era included Joseph McCoy. He ran a stockyard in Abilene near the railroad hub where you could bring your cattle and have them counted and get paid out for delivering them. And then Buffalo Bill was an entertainer who started a whole Wild West show that traveled around the world internationally as well and made cowboy culture popular, and was famous for just entertaining people with stories and entertainment from the West. He hired a woman, a talented sharpshooter, her name is Calamity Jane, who would also entertain people in the Wild West show. And he also got people like Sitting Bull, Native Americans, to join the Wild West show and become basically kind of like freak show attractions, I guess, in a way that that were kind of disturbing in the way that they kind of reduced Native culture to a stereotype, but did bring in lots of people in the time period. So the government policies or legislation that affected cowboys are really very few, except for the fact that the government gave land to the railroad companies to sell so they could raise the money to build the railroads. So what I'm basically trying to tell you is there wouldn't have been cowboys without the railroads. And there wouldn't have been railroads without the government, because the government gave the land to the railroad companies. And then the railroad companies sold the land to have the money to then lay down the tracks. So that was the role the government had in helping along the cowboy era. Here you can see all of the routes that became popular for cowboys to walk on to get their cattle to market. The cultural characteristics of the cowboys include things like wearing boots and spurs to spur their horses on to keep up with the cattle. And they wore chaps to protect their legs and keep their pants from wearing thin, and had 6 shooters, of course, to fight against dangers like snakes and cattle stealers. And, of course, they had to sing to their cattle. They had to have good songs to keep their cattle calm. But they were long, long hours, starting early in the morning at 4 or so in the morning, and then would end late at night as they got the cattle settled for the evening and sat around their little campfire. See my little campfire? And they would sing, sing some songs of the West, like, "Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day." Just like that. Yeah, that was it. Thank you. Very good. The cowboys' life was kind of lonely, but boy, when they finally got their cattle to the stockyards and sold them off, and then they got paid out in cash. And that's why the Wild Wild West is called the Wild Wild West. You had a whole lot of young men hanging around who had weapons, cash. They'd just been paid out. They could drink a lot of alcohol. And whenever you combine young men, alcohol, and weapons, and a lot of money, might even have a bent towards prostitution houses in the West during this time period, it really was the Wild Wild West. Okay, and that's part of the mystique of cowboy culture, is all of those elements. So, yeah, it was an interesting time period, that's for sure. The next group we're going to be looking at is the miners. The key events in bringing miners out west include strikes, big strikes in 1848. There was a series of big strikes in California, Nevada, and Mexico, and Colorado, which were telegraphed across the country and got a whole bunch of people, called the 49ers in 1849, to start streaming westward, families and young men, to try and find gold. They included veterans from the Civil War, young men who were seeking opportunities and maybe did not have land easily accessible in the East, so they wanted to come west. Some families as well. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but a lot more men than women came out west. The government policies, there really were none. Mining was just a vigilante kind of catch-as-catch-can. These wildcat towns would pop up with people searching for gold, and since there was no police force there, or property tax base necessarily to provide for a police force, instead you got kind of vigilante justice, where people would kind of play police, the good guys against the bad guys, trying to enforce some sense of order. But it really was another aspect of just the Wild Wild West. They do a lot of different types of mining. They do the easiest form is surface mining, where you just kind of find gold or silver right under the surface. But they also did a lot of panning, where you get a pan and put some holes in it, or just use the current to help you sift out the dust from the nuggets of precious stones that you find. I'm going to show you sluicing, and then also they would dig very deep mine shafts, which were very dangerous and could cause cave-ins and people falling in them and those kinds of things, but were sometimes necessary to get really a big opportunity to find big gold. This is an example of panning and streams. Sluicing uses something like this. This is kind of like what you would see at the fair when you can get a bag of sand and then set it down in a current, and the current kind of carries off the silt and leaves behind the solid matter. So that's mining, okay? And then the final group we're going to be talking about is laborers or workers who come west. Their main project is the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Here you can see the two parts of it. There was part of the railroad that went from east to west. And this was the Union Pacific Railroad. And then they built this part going from west to east, and that's called the Central Pacific Railroad. It looks like the Central Pacific people were lazy and didn't build very far, but they actually had to blast through the Rocky Mountains. And so their job was much more arduous because of that geographic reality. So the key events are that in 1869, they complete the first transcontinental railroad. They meet up in Promontory Point, Utah, and now we have a continuous railroad line spanning the whole country, which is going to really revolutionize travel and distances in the United States. This is a fantastic picture of the meeting of the two railroads that day at Promontory Point. You can see they're celebrating with champagne and shaking hands. They actually had a golden spike they put into the ground, and also one attached to a telegraph wire, so the moment they struck it in, it was known throughout the world that this Transcontinental Railroad project had been finished. You'll see in time that lots of railroads form. All these red lines include later completed railroads, and so by the 1880s, there's a lot of railroad lines going all the way across the West. These laborers, the key people, were the Irish, who came and built the railroad from the east going west. And then the Chinese were the main workers who built the railroad going from the west to the east. And then African Americans, a lot of freed slaves, came out and saw this as an opportunity for them to build wealth and gain job opportunities. So those were the main groups that built the railroads. The government policies or legislation we've kind of already talked to when we talked about the Cowboys, the government giving the land to the railroad companies. The problem is that, as I tell you here, they had a real opportunity to kind of regulate how the railroads were going to be built in terms of how wide the rails were going to be and how far apart they were going to be set apart. But unfortunately, the government didn't seize upon this idea, and so all the railroads are going to not necessarily connect to each other. Let me help you understand this. So what I'm saying is it would have been cool if when the railroads gave away the land, they made it contingent upon, we're going to put all the rails a certain distance apart. And we're going to make the rails a certain width. But they didn't do that, and so instead the railroads don't all connect to each other because they don't actually, they're not built the same way, which is a big opportunity cost. It's not until Cornelius Vanderbilt gets control of the railroads that he's going to standardize them all, and he's going to monopolize the railroad industry for a period of time while he standardizes them all and makes them connective with each other. The cultural characteristics of being a railroad worker were a lot of digging, a lot of dynamite, very low pay, and they lived in railroad bunks as they traveled down the line building the railroad, so they lived in very close quarters with really no privacy. It was very easy to catch diseases this way. It's just a very difficult way to live, and it was well known that railroad work was really work that no native-born Americans wanted to engage in because it was so difficult. The key events include, the last group that takes on the plains is the farmers. They're the ones who are going to control the plains even today. The plains are really seen for their farming. The key people on the plains, farmers, are families. Women are very key. They're the ones who do everything but the farming. So the cooking, the cleaning, the sewing, the education of the children. They keep house, educate kids, prepare food, make clothing. It's very hard to live out west if you don't have a wife, and so therefore when people's spouses died, they might very quickly find themselves remarrying people they hardly know just because the family unit was so key to actually being able to survive out in the west. The government policies include the Homestead Act in 1862. They passed a law during the Civil War that said you could get 160 acres of free land if you were willing to live on it for 5 years and improve it. Also, the Morrill Act was passed, which allowed us to have farm colleges for the first time. This is how NC State and North Carolina Agricultural and Technical came to exist, is because the government had the foresight to establish colleges that would do research related to agriculture. And then the Hatch Act gave them the money to do the research on things like hybrid breeds, and fertilizer, and those kinds of research projects. So the cultural characteristics are that they live in sod houses. Their houses are made of sod because there's very few trees out in the west. They also have dugouts, which is where they live. They dig into a hillside, like a cave, and will live in that rather than build a house out of dirt. They need plows. The steel plow, invented by John Deere, becomes an absolute essential element of their culture. And they have these windmills. You can see a windmill right here. That's used to help pump water from the ground for their use. And that's a key thing. And then also they need the reaper. That helps them reap their crops. Okay. You can see that this is a sod house, and they've built a doorway made out of wood. Might have even broken down their wagon that they came out on to use the wood to create the house. We're going to finish up with what I consider to be the best photo of the West ever. You can see how these people have lined up here. They have kind of a dugout that they've dug into the side of this hill. That's why there's a cow on top of their house. He's not actually on the house. He's on the hill that their house is built into. And then they have a sod facade on their house. And they've lined up their horses like they're members of the family. They've lined up the family. They have a special occasion here with their watermelon. They even have windows in their house, which was considered to be quite snazzy back then. So it's just a really interesting picture that tells you a lot about what life in the West was like. And that's it. That's an overview of everything you need to know about the West as it relates to chapter 13 in your book. Okay? See you soon. Bye.